All right, hello and welcome. So today we're going to talk about defenses in patch 0.7.10, which is the newest patch as of this recording. In fact, it just dropped yesterday. The defenses were completely overhauled. And yeah, it really is that big of a difference. Pretty much everything, or just about everything, has changed in some way. And many things have changed in huge ways that are completely transformative to the game and how we gear. So today we're going to talk about what those changes are in some detail, try to cover everything that has changed. This will be targeted towards people who have played the game in the past and are trying to adjust to the new defenses, but it will also be helpful to new players as we'll be covering basically every defense in some way or another. All right, let's get started, and we'll start with protections versus resistances. So in 0.7.9 and before, one of the large defensive mechanics was protections. Protections was basically a system where you built up protection for different types of damage, and you could scale it infinitely. And there was a resistance percentage on it, but that resistance percentage was not really, let's just say it was misleading, because you could actually build up infinite EHP technically, not really, because, you know, there's only so many sources you get, but you could just continue to scale it up and up and up. It was directly tied to HP as a ratio, which caused some problems for whether or not you should actually stack HP. Generally, you would not want to stack HP if you were stacking protection. So this was a pretty significant problem, since it actually disincentivized players to stack health, which is a pretty normal thing to do in an ARPG. It was also very difficult to grasp because of the ratio between the protections and the HP, and the fact that you could get EHP for every point of protections you can get, but it also negatively affects your ratio, making it harder to regen. That was just all really complex. And so for those two reasons, the complexity of the system and the negative effects on HP scaling, it was probably good that it had to go. So now here we are, and we have the resistance system. Resistance system should be familiar to a lot of RPG players. It's a percentage-based system that caps out at 75%. So you get pieces of gear that have resistance on them. That resistance is a percentage, and that percentage is a direct percentage. So if you get like 5% necrotic resistance, you have an additional 5% necrotic resistance up to a cap of 75%. Pretty intuitive, pretty easy to largely grasp for most players. So in this way, the system has become a lot more easy to understand, to get into, whether you're a new player or an existing player. And its other benefit is not at all tied to HP, so scaling HP will not affect the percentage of resistance that you are actually getting from each piece of resistance. So for these reasons, probably a good move to go to the resistance system. There are some other factors in the resistance system, though, that are good to know. For one, the system has this built-in penetration system for the enemies, where they gain 1% penetration per level up to level 75. So they get 75% penetration on your resistances at level 75, which, if you think about it, like, oh, wait a second, that means I have 0% resistances if they're penetrating the entire amount, which is technically true, but you can go negative. So if you had none, you'd have negative 75% resistance, which would be really bad for you, take a whole lot of damage. The reason this is in place is to make it more intuitive how much damage you're going to take if you're not capped. And this is really how you should think about it. Don't worry so much about the fact that there's this penetration system, but just know this: if you're at a level 75 and you have, let's say, 70% resistances towards a particular damage type, you will take 5% more damage towards that resistance type than if you were capped at 75%. This is different than games like PoE, where it was actually a much greater amount. If you had 25% less resistance in PoE than if you were capped, you take like 100% more damage, you take like double damage. So this system makes it more clear when you are, or how much damage you're going to take if you're not capped, and also it makes it less punishing if you're not capped. So if you got 25% less than the cap, you're only at 50%, you're literally taking 25% more damage, not 100% more damage. So that is something to bear in mind as you're doing this. A lot of players from PoE are going to freak out if they're not capped at endgame. It's not that big of a deal in this game. It's good to be capped, but it's not like the end of the world if you're not. The other thing to know is you can actually overcap in this game. And while that won't give you any more mitigation in normal fights, it does help you when enemies shred your resistances, which several of them can. So if an enemy shreds, let's say 25% of your resistance and you're only at the cap, well, now you take 25% more damage. But if you happen to have 100% resistance, you're still capped at 75%, but now that 25% shred that you're taking doesn't actually affect you because you're still at the 75% cap. Those are the two major features of the system that I'd say are different than a lot of other games to bear in mind. All right, let's move on to some of the other changes. That's probably the biggest one, but there are other things that have changed as well. One of them is, along with the resistance change, armor has also changed. Armor used to be one of the resistances. It was the physical protections, technically. It used to be one of the protections. It was a physical protection. It's now been moved out of that system, which is now the resistance system. And physical resistance is now in place. So you have the three elemental resistances, you have physical resistance, you've got necrotic, you've got poison, you've got void, and then you've got this separate system over here that is armor. Now, resistances will mitigate all types of damage. They mitigate dots, they mitigate hits, which is pretty much, it's basically everything in the game. Armor only mitigates hits, so it doesn't affect dots, but because it's this second layer of defense, it can be very powerful. So armor will also, unlike its predecessor version, mitigate all types of hits, not just physical. So we have this additional layer. We have resistances, we have armor. And armor also has a cap. It's got a hard cap, but also diminishing returns. It caps at 65%. And then diminishing returns will kick in. If you want to see specifics of how that looks, the diminishing returns side, you can go check it out at Tunk Lab. He's got up a really nice graphing system that you can use to see what the diminishing returns look like at different levels of armor and at different levels of monster level, which is also affected by. Also, something to note on armor is there's a armor effectiveness threshold that has been added to the game, which is kind of like a one-shot sort of limiter, I guess you could say. It's meant to prevent there being too many one-shots in the game with armor. So what happens with this system is if you're underneath a particular level of HP, this HP threshold, you will have 25% increased effectiveness on your armor. And so it's going to mitigate more damage at these lower levels of HP. And the specific formula used there is it's 30 plus 3 per level. Might sound kind of complicated, it's really not. Let's say you're level 10, 30 HP plus 3 per 10 levels, so 3 times 10 is 30, so 60 HP at level 10. At level 100, it would be 30 plus 3 times 100, 300 plus 30, 330 HP. And that's going to be across the board, all builds, all classes, all characters. So it's pretty easy to figure out how much the threshold is at, regardless of what you're playing. All right, another thing that's changed with the protection system is block, which used to be tied directly to block. Block effectiveness would actually increase your protections across the board for all damage types that you actually blocked. And now it's a separate defense mitigation with its own cap of 75% and also diminishing returns. So it's a very similar effect to armor, except you actually have to block it. You have to use a shield or some other block mechanic or talent. And then whatever your block effectiveness is will be its equivalent of what armor would be in that other mechanic. So the more block effectiveness you have, the more you'll mitigate every time you block with a cap of 75%. And with diminishing returns, again, similar to armor. Next on the list is Glancing Blow. Glancing Blow used to work in a way that you could get a % chance to get a Glancing Blow and it'd mitigate 50% of damage taken from hits. So kind of similar to armor, where armor is mitigating hits, but it was a straight amount reduction and you were increasing the chance, whereas armor, the chance is 100% on hits, and you just increase the amount that you reduce. Glancing Blow still exists in the game, but it's in very few sources. I think it's only in passives now. So you won't be able to cap it anymore. Many classes won't even have access to it. Basically, it's something that you don't have to worry about at all unless it's in your passive tree, and then it's just another decision to make on your passive tree, whether or not you want a little bit of Glancing Blow in your build or not. It's no longer the type of thing that you have to have like it used to be. So all these changes, how do they affect other areas of defense like HP Ward and Regen? We talked about how protections were actually negative towards HP in a lot of cases where you wouldn't want to stack HP. So now that it doesn't scale with Prots, it means stacking HP is no longer a detrimental thing. As long as you can regen your HP, then that's good, but it's not going to actually affect your Prots, or in this case your resistances or your armor. Since those are independent, you can scale both now and feel fine about that, not feel like you're hamstring yourself in one defense or another. So that's a big plus to this this system. It allows for more interesting HP option builds and regen option builds that were not as viable maybe in the previous patches. Some other things that happened because of these changes is set health and health regen were removed. They probably would have been very powerful in this current version, so they no longer exist. It's also of note that Vitality now offers another source of HP and regen, as it offers 10 HP per Vitality and 2% regen. So that does offer an additional source of HP scaling. As far as ward goes, not a whole lot changed mechanically for ward itself, but the Spellblade tree got a complete rework, and a lot of it is ward based. So it's definitely worth, if you like ward, if you like the mechanic of ward, checking out the new Spellblade tree and seeing if that is up your alley as an option for defense. I believe personally that's going to be quite strong. And so this is giving us another option that maybe wasn't so ideal or really so viable last patch. Okay, so we haven't talked about dodge, which is definitely one of the main defense mechanics. And that's largely because not a whole lot really changed with dodge. One thing that did change was set dodge was removed, which is a very powerful affix. But the other affixes are still there. The suffix that gives you base, the prefix that gives you increased dodge, so it can still be quite powerful to use it. And otherwise, it's effectively the same thing. It's got the same formula, the same cap of 80%. I expect dodge to be pretty strong in the current patch. All right, we talked about Vitality. Let's talk about the other stat, Attunement. This doesn't really have a whole lot to do with defense, except for it used to have elemental protection. It's 5 LE prots per point. With a new resistance system similar to Vitality, both of them giving prots doesn't make sense in the new resistance system, because at some point you could actually outscale it and you get capped, and then you don't really want a primary stat anymore. That's not good. So as Vitality is giving HP and regen, now Attunement gives 2 mana. So it's not going to really do anything for you for defenses, but it does give you some other benefit being in the mana side. Another thing to add that probably hasn't been talked about much elsewhere is there are 2 new affixes, and they are pretty strong for defense. The first one, and maybe the most obvious good choice, is called Frailty. It can be applied on hits, and I believe it does show up on both melee weapons and several pieces of armor. And it's stronger on the melee weapons than the armor, but both have pretty good amounts of it. It reduces incoming damage from the source by 6%, the source being the enemy, and it can stack up to 3 times, so you can get 18% damage reduction on the enemy by using Frailty as an affix, which is a pretty powerful amount of damage reduction. The other one is reduced crit damage. I'm not entirely sure everything that this can go on, as can be applied to. I know it can go on two-handed axes, probably some other two-handers, but it's relatively limited to what it can go on. But it reduces damage when taking a crit. Now you might think, okay, well, we already have critical strike avoidance, just cap that and you're good, and that is one option. And you might also think, well, this can't be all that strong. Let's say you have 50% reduced damage taken on a crit, and you take 100 damage, and then it crits 200%, and so now you take 300 damage, and you take 50% off of the crit damage, and you're only at like, what, 200 or something like that. But that's not actually how it works. It actually reduces all of the damage on a crit. It's not just reducing the crit damage itself. So if it's 50% off of 300, it's actually like you take 150. So that's pretty solid, actually. So don't overlook reduced crit damage, because it's only one affix, and it gives a lot of reduced crit damage. If you're struggling to find places to gear or to put affixes that you want, crit avoidance is taking up a lot of space, you could just use reduced crit damage instead. It's not quite as powerful, but it's pretty close. Another option. Okay, last thing. We'll talk about relevant mastery changes. We've already talked about Spellblade, as it gives you a lot more ward now, but it's got other features, including some defensive features to check out. Forge Guard also got completely changed. So its damage reduction mastery bonus has been changed to armor. And the armor cap will be especially relevant when stacking armor on Forge Guard, because before, if you just had damage reduction, well, it's a straight reduction. I think you get up to 30% damage reduction in 0.7, 0.9. But now it's going to be like a stacking increase in your armor the more you get hit. But because there is that cap and that diminishing returns, it'll be interesting to see just how tanky Forge Guard is now in comparison to 0.7, 0.9. Hard to say. Gonna definitely need some testing to see. My guess is, though, Forge Guard is going to be a bit less tanky than it was before. Okay, that covers all of the defensive changes. I hope this was informative. If you have any questions further beyond what has been covered here, please feel free to ask. Also, come check out the stream on Twitch 5 to 6 days a week. And also, we do have a Discord where we like to discuss all things LE, other games. There's also now a new loot filter section. So if you are looking for loot filters to use for your builds, definitely check that out as well. All right, thank you so much for watching. Have a great time in Last Epoch, and I'll see you all again real soon.